On the 29th of April, the North Vietnamese got very impatient because Ambassador Graham Martin was not taking any action as far as evacuation. He was determined to negotiate with the North Vietnamese. And the North Vietnamese had no reason to negotiate. I mean, there were about 19 divisions that were already surrounding Saigon. So they say, why should we negotiate? You're surrounded. They decided to shell and bomb the Tan Son Nhut airstrip. And so they started rocketing with artillery fire. And unfortunately, two of those Marines that were there, of the 18 that were there, Judge and McMahon, got killed. Once those Marines got killed, then pretty much the ambassador had to change his story as far as when to stay and negotiate, because now he knew that the North Vietnamese were going to take over the whole country. Operation Frequent Wings began basically on the 29th of April of 1975. They send troops from the ship, Marine troops. You know, they send a platoon, which is about 50 Marines, to assist us at the embassy. And they came into the embassy, and by this time, masses of people had situated themselves all around the embassy. You know, there were so many people that we couldn't even open the gates. At the beginning, we knew who we were supposed to evacuate because we were given documents showing Xerox copies of the passes, documents of who we could take. We were to take, first of all, of course, Americans. Second, Vietnamese that worked for the embassy. And not only the embassy, but the other American buildings, such as USIS, USID, DAO. And then we were also supposed to take foreign embassy personnel, like the Koreans, the Brits, and so on. So those people all had documents that proved to them who they were. But because of all these masses of people, a lot of those people got caught in the crowd and they were way in the back. So some of them had to fight their way to the embassy, to the walls, to where the gates were at. There were 4 gates at the embassy. There was a vehicle gate, there was the front gate that led you to the main embassy. There was the consulate gate, which people could go to the consulate and get passports. And there was the CRA gate, Combined Recreational Association gate. So those gates became totally clouded up with people. And the only way we could get these people out and look at their documentations was for them to get up to the gate, because we were not going to open the gates anymore. Every time we opened the gates, they would push them in and somebody would sneak in through the crowd. So the only way we could bring those people aboard was to get on each other's shoulder, go over the gates with our arms and bring them up, and then we could get them inside the embassy. So that went on for a number of hours. I, for one, and the major, we kept going to different locations and checking on the troops, making sure they were okay. Uh, and we kept that on for a while. The ambassador, at one point, after he found out that Judge and McMahon had been killed, he didn't want to believe that that had happened. I mean, he knew that the airstrip had been bombed, but he didn't want to accept the fact that Judge and McMahon had been killed. But I mean, we had gotten word. We had gotten word from General Smith. Smith was a DAO officer, and he was out at Tonsanud, and he had already called in and alerted us, because we had to send a report back to battalion so that the parents of Judge and McMahon could be notified that they had been deceased. But again, the ambassador was a old stubborn warrior. He didn't want to take anybody's word for it. As I mentioned to you, he didn't want to evacuate. He didn't want us to give any notion that we were evacuating. So he wanted to go out to Tonsanud, and he could not. He tried to get his vehicle from inside the embassy out to the gates, and as we slightly opened those gates, and those people pushed on the gates, and we closed the gates and said, "Mr. Ambassador, you can't go out there." So he took some of his Marines, because the ambassador was assigned 7 what they call PSUs, Protective Service Unit. They're pretty much like the Secret Service for the state. They protect the President of the United States whenever he travels. Well, that's the way the PSUs were. They lived at the ambassador's residence, and anytime the ambassador had a meeting or a function off the grounds, they went with him. And so he took a couple of them, and he went through a back gate and either found a vehicle. I'm sure he didn't walk up there, because it was about like 7 or 8 miles to the embassy. So that's quite a walk to go that far. So anyway, they probably found another vehicle, and they took the ambassador to Tonsanud. And of course, once he saw all the potholes that had been done on the airstrip, he knew that you could no longer evacuate or have fixed air wing come into the airport. And he saw that the damage and that had been caused by the shelling, and witnessed the bodies of the deceased. So he came back to the embassy. By this time, we had already started also destroying classified material. Everyone on the embassy had their own ways of destroying classified material. Shredders, every office had a shredder. Where there were incinerators on the top of the roof, where there were 2 huge incinerators that we were throwing classified material and burning it up. We burned for 3 days constantly without stopping, that some of the shredders started melting. I mean, you could actually see big holes in the shredders where they were so hot they started melting. The ambassador didn't leave till about maybe around 6 o'clock in the morning. And actually, the password or the keyword for the ambassador that he was gone was Tiger, Tiger, Tiger. And it was one of the Marine pilots was designated by the general out at sea after President Ford gave the order that if the ambassador resisted leaving, they were to take him by the shoulders, take him up to the roof, and put him in the helicopter and send him out to sea to the ship. So at just about that time, the American flag was lowered. It was folded by Corporal Smith. He presented the flag to the ambassador and the logbook because every post keeps a logbook, and he gave him the logbook, and the ambassador went up to the 6th floor and then went up to the helipad and went aboard. Not even, the DCM was up there also, along with some of the other diplomatic people, but the pilot said, "No, you cannot go. I have orders to only take the ambassador." So the ambassador flew by himself to the ship. I think it was the USS Blue Ridge, which was a command ship for the whole fleet out there. So once he left, then we got the word, we being the Marines, Major King, myself, that the Marine had left, that the ambassador had left, and that we would only be evacuating American personnel from that point on. By this time, most Americans had already left, with a few exceptions. There were a few diplomatic Americans still on the grounds of the embassy. So we gathered out all the Marines that had come in from the fleet to assist us, and our Marines, the Marine security guards, which were left, because as I mentioned to you, about 18 or 19 of them were already at the Tan Son Nhut. Those Marines at Tan Son Nhut evacuated from that point. They went to the ship from Tan Son Nhut. But the rest of us decided to form like semicircles. So we made 3 semicircles facing the walls of the embassy. We made one big outer one, medium one, and an inner one. And then we started, with our backs to the embassy, we started moving inboard. And the first and second perimeters, they were able to successfully get inside the embassy. When it got to the very last one, which I was part of, the crowd by this time sort of kind of put 2 and 2 together and say, hey, I think these guys are evacuating, they're all going inside the embassy. So we started moving back, stepping backwards, and just about halfway through, they decided that they were going to, push the gates as far as they would go and climb on them and find refuge inside the embassy grounds. So that's what they did. They started climbing the gates, jumping on the grounds, and they came right at us. So we pretty much winded up in armed combat to combat, armed fighting, just hitting each other, but still backing up until we finally got to the door, and we just pretty much, we sealed ourselves inside the embassy. There were 2 elevators at the lobby. A couple of Marines took all the elevators up to the 6th floor, and they locked them up there, disable the power. And there were 6 floors in the embassy, starting with the ground floor, and every second floor had gates on the stairwells. So as the Marines went up the stairwells, the very last Marines would lock the gates, the steel gates, and lock them, and then they would go up to the 4th deck and lock those gates. So they finally ended up at the 6th. So all the gates on the stairwells were locked, the elevators were all locked, and we ended up on the roof. All those Marines and also the infantry that had come to assist us. So we were able to view from the roof, our surroundings down on the ground, on the grounds of the embassy, and see what was going on. Some people were still sitting there waiting to be evacuated, but by this time there was no more evacuation from the ground, because we had already been told that only Americans could evacuate, and we had gotten all the Americans out of there. So the embassy doors were locked, the elevators were locked, the gates on every other floor were secured, and then we noted that one of the Vietnamese jumped on the fire trucks. We always kept 2 fire trucks on the grounds in case there was a fire in the grounds of the embassy. Well, he drove that big fire truck right into the door where earlier we had found access to the embassy, and he broke those doors, and that was an entrance for the Vietnamese that were still on the ground. They delayed no time in going into the embassy, and then since they found out the the elevators were secured, and they noted that they could easily climb the gates that were on the stairwells. So that's what they started doing. They started climbing every other floor and climbing the gates. And eventually those Vietnamese ended up on the 6th floor and in the incinerator room, but not on the roof with us, because we had sealed that particular door. We had put fire extinguishers and wall lockers and a bunch of other heavy material to keep that door sealed. And so we were just sitting there. They could, by this time now that the Vietnamese had gotten access that far, they could see us through the glass on the door, but they couldn't get access to us on the roof. because all the Marines had weapons. So by this time, I instructed a couple of Marines to pick up their weapons and kind of walk back and forth, so that would deter the Vietnamese inside the door on the other side from trying to break the door or push the things off the door and get on with us. And that continued on while the helicopters continued landing. And as a helicopter would pick up a group of Marines, then we would send another group up there. They would land, and that went on forever for at least a couple of hours, you know. Finally, the last Marines pretty much left. And the only ones that were left, there was a total of 11 of us. That would have been Major King, my commanding officer, myself, which was a detachment commander, my assistant, Gunnery Sergeant Sullivan was my assistant. He was there, and it was about 6 or 7 other Marines. But it was a total of 11 Marines that were still left there on the roof. So we figured within the next half hour there would be a helicopter to pick us up. But that wasn't the case. It was well past an hour and still no helicopters. So we got sort of suspicious, you know. We didn't know what had delayed, and we were unaware that Kissinger had given the word out, although Kissinger was back in Washington, D.C., but somebody on the fleet had called back to Washington and said that the Marines are out, the evacuation is over with, you know. And he announced that the evacuation had been completed and all the Marines, all personnel were off the roof. Well, that wasn't the case. As I mentioned, there were still 11 of us on the roof. So we all sat there, kind of pretty much not excited, and everybody was in a different place, sitting down, and everybody was pretty much in their thoughts. Nobody was screaming or getting excited. Some of us were thinking, for example, were we going to shoot it out? Were we going to surrender? One of my thoughts that came to mind was that since they had bombed Thompson Newton with artillery, which were close by the artillery, what was to keep them from using that artillery and bomb us and blow us off the embassy roof, you know? There was no reason for them that they could have done that. But actually we kept the low profile too, because we kept down low where nobody could see us on top of the roof, you know? So anyway, we were there till close to 7:58, just about 15 minutes prior to 7:58. We saw 2 helicopters that were coming in. It was a CH-46 helicopter and a gunship, what they call a Cobra. It protects that particular helicopter. He came in, he circled twice, he landed, and I started putting the Marines in there on there. The 2 Marines that I had guarding the doors, I told them to make 2 more passes, and then as soon as they make that last pass to run, climb the roof, and jump into the helicopter. And that's pretty much what happened. I was the last one to get aboard, and the pilots, you could tell that they were anxious to get out of there, because as soon as I landed my foot on the ramp, they started lifting up. The ramp still coming up as I was standing on the ramp, so I fell down. But eventually somebody pulled me inside, they closed the hatch, and we left there, you know. I got to get a sort of a view of the streets briefly, you know, as we could see tanks at a distance that they were coming in already. So the helicopter, which his call sign was Swift, he started going out to the ship, not realizing that the ships were about 25 miles out at sea. So it was taking the helicopters about half an hour to go from the roof to drop off their passengers and then coming back. Well, on the way to the ship, which would have been the USS Okinawa, the fuel light on the helicopter came on, saying that the helicopter was short on flight, or short on fuel. So we really didn't panic, but we kind of were concerned that maybe we had gone through all this excitement and we were now on our way to the safety to the ship, and we might not be able to make it, you know. They might have to pick us up from the water, you know. But I guess the good Lord was with us because we made it all the way to the ship. As we were flying back to the ship, to the USS Okinawa. By that time now we were kind of a little relieved, and we kind of aired our feelings out. And Sergeant Frayne, one of the Marine security guards, you know, he pretends that he's got a phone in his hand, and he says, "Hey, Major, the ship just called. He wants to know what sort of pizza you want." You know, that was about the most hilarious thing that we'd heard going back to the ship. Yeah, we have our website, www.followsaigon.org, and anyone can access that site, and it will have pretty much the story of the fall of Saigon on the Marines' part. It's upgraded all the time, and the media is always seeking information. They go to our website. There's a lot of books that have been wrote of them. On my bookcase around here, you'll see I've got about 15, 20 books on the fall of Saigon. There's a lot of documentation on Saigon. But people are still talking about it. It seems to be a war that it's not forgotten, you know. Korea, they call it the lost war. Nobody ever hardly speaks of Korea, but Vietnam, it's not a lost war. There's always media on it, and every anniversary somebody will contact me from the media, you know, can you give us a little something about Vietnam, you know, so I have to get on the phone and talk to them. So I'm always reminded. I try not to think about it, but normally in April somebody reminds me about the fall of Saigon. Semper Fi.